I wanted to talk about this is that women and children, we should envision these armies with women and children. In fact, my idea is start thinking about it, visualizing an army that is not just the core organization or institution with the soldiers in uniform and in ranks, but then around them, maybe running through the ranks, you have got women, you've got children, you've got animals. I mean, you think about other kinds of followers, and you've got beef on the hoof, and you've got pigs, and you've got dogs, you've got the horses. And so you start to visualize then a scene that is not always uniform and not always as regimented as we tend to think about them. And when we have that wider vision, we can then see these women and children who are following the British and provincial forces all the way into the borderlands of North America throughout this 7 Years' War. And those borderlands include Western Pennsylvania, or what they often called the Ohio country. And so that includes then these women with Braddock's and Forbes's expeditions, 1755, 1758, which is where I'm pulling some of the examples. But as we talk about them, we're putting ourselves in their shoes, because most of them are walking these trails with the soldiers, walking through the mountains with them, fording the rivers. They are doing much of what they are doing. But to pick up on an old term for Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers movies, these women were doing the same thing soldiers were doing in some ways, but they were doing it in skirts and with children hanging on to those skirts in many situations. Okay, but they were burdened with the children, they were burdened with packs, they were not armed. Okay, so these again are women and children who are not often acknowledged in the accounts. They're not often seen, but sometimes they are in illustrations of 18th century warfare. But they were absolutely integral to the logistics, the provisioning, the movement, the healthcare of armies in that period. These followers helped maintain the troops and indeed helped maintain ultimately the forts that were planted in these borderlands. And these were important to extending British sovereignty into these other areas. These women and children, well, mostly the women, we won't say the children, accompanied the troops sometimes on their own initiative. They chose to be there, whether or not they were welcome, and of course, as allowed by the military commanders. Furthermore, what we're looking at is to follow meant to work, okay? Again, this work could be by their own initiative, or it could be by the command of the orders of the officers. So whether by choice or command, the women following Braddock and Forbes were supporting these incursions into Western Pennsylvania. And in the process, they faced the trials, including death, that the troops faced. So what does a comparison of women followers, both with these expeditions and elsewhere in this same period, reveal about the women who trudged into the shades of death? And I love that term, shades of death. This was, something I picked up from Colonel Adam Stephen when he wrote to Bouquet. And this was in 1758, and he was talking about going into the shades of death, which apparently travelers into Pennsylvania considered. And you can just see them shivering a bit and thinking about where are they going and how dark it was, that the forest was so dense in Western Pennsylvania that sunlight could not penetrate it in some areas. And these were the shades of death. And this is where you could have some fear about marching through these territories, is if you can't see well, if it is hidden in these shades, what is facing you. So as we look at these women followers moving with the soldiers into the shades of death, I want us to consider their origins, their social ranks, their challenges, and the labor that they performed. And I want to do this in somewhat of a comparison, a comparative manner. So I want to start with somebody who is named, who is famous, because this is another issue that we face when we're looking for women. So many are not named. how do you do the history of the unnamed? They may appear sometimes in a company roster or regimental roster, and sometimes it is just in association with a soldier. So we might not have her whole name, we might just have a last name in association with that soldier. Sometimes we don't even have that. We just have some kind of a roster with a listing of about how many women are being provisioned on that company's rolls. So that's telling us they're there, but it's not necessarily telling us who they are. So I was picking up on one or two women who are named. What does it mean that they're named? And using that as the springboard into thinking about those who are not named. So one of the most famous and certainly named women with Braddock's expedition was Charlotte Brown. She was the matron of the Braddock's Expedition General Hospital. So, maybe some of you have heard of Charlotte Brown. Maybe you have read her diary or excerpts of her diary. But the question that we have, if we start to read about Charlotte Brown and we bring her up, is how representative is she of other women with the forces, or was she just an exception? And if we take her as an exception, how does the exception prove or support the rule? So let's start with origins. Where did Charlotte Brown come from, and how did she get to Western Pennsylvania? Well, Brown actually sailed from the British Islands in early 1755, moving along with the regiments that had been garrisoned in Ireland and that were now being shipped up and assigned to the colonies. In this case, talking perhaps about the 44th Regiment with Sir Peter Halkett, or the 48th under Robert Dunbar. So she is with these, so she is coming out of Britain. Now, when these regiments got across the pond, they landed there in late March in the colonies. They were then added to, because they had not shipped out full strength. And so they're pulling soldiers from other regiments, and they are pulling soldiers and certainly attached units from the provinces. And with those attached units and with those provincial units come women as well. So given that background, Brown could be seen as representative of the other British women who sailed across the ocean with these regiments, who sailed with the troops. Okay, so she serves with that. We know that women crossed. They weren't just all here. But then we come back to, how did those other women get berths on the ships? There's a difference. Brown would have gotten her berth on the ship as that matron. She already had a position. So that was given to her, as opposed to so many berths being assigned to so many women with a company or with a regiment. She is not one of the 3 to 6 women that were generally assigned to a company. Now, there's differences of opinion. Some references say, oh, the Army permitted approximately 6 women per company to follow the forces. Other references have said things like 1 woman to every 25 men, or 3 women per company, which is essentially 3 women per 100 is what they were thinking. Well, those numbers aren't exact. Furthermore, when we think about those numbers, they're not exact in that many of those numbers are related to how many women could actually ship out. Once the regiments got in country, if you will, in the colonies, they would be joined by other women who might then fill out those who are allowed by the commanders. And they certainly could be women who are not allowed. So we don't have exact numbers, but would say that Charlotte Brown was not one of those numbers, but she was a separate woman, separate the way that a few officers' wives who may have followed would have been separate. So British woman crossing the ocean with British regiments, but she's not one of the soldiers' women or exactly a follower that way. Furthermore, of course, those British women are then joined by the provincial women. These are women out of the colonies that would have joined, and they could have been following the British regiments themselves or following the provincial units. So coming out of that with the origins, what this is just telling us in this comparison with Charlotte Brown is that you've got to think of all of those with the armies as not coming from any one particular place, that they may belong to a place with a particular regiment, but with all these other companies, we are having, if you will, diverse women and a cacophony of women with different dialects, different ways of acting, different ways of speaking, who are all coming within the military realm and thus learning how to follow an army, to do the work of an army, and hopefully follow orders in some form or another. There is a mixture in the origins of these women. So we take it a step further, the social ranks and the positions. Well, when we start, one of the biggest social ranks for a woman is whether you're married or not. Charlotte Brown was a widow. She got her position individually, changing her a little bit there, but she was also accompanying her brother. So she was attached in one way to a man, a service member, an apothecary with it. He's not directly in the ranks, but there is that attachment. So she's a widow. That is unlike most of the other women who, to be able to follow, had to show a legitimate connection. And usually that legitimate connection was marriage. A marriage that had been proven earlier before that service member joined a regiment or company, and they bring that in, or that maybe they had been following and they were acceptable to the company's officers, and the company officer may have married them in what could have been more of like a civil marriage, okay, civil law marriage, or common law marriage, excuse me, in this. So widow versus wife. Now, a few of the other children would have been perhaps young women, daughters, who may have followed, but usually once you're starting to get into your teens and thereabouts, you're aging out of being a child dependent. And at that point, usually there is, are you going to be attached or married to another soldier to be able to get your rations that way, to be accepted with the company that way? So marital status was different from Charlotte Brown than the majority of the acceptable authorized women with the regiments in there. Her appointment separates her. Most would have been following first and then possibly put to work after they had already been following. Class is another issue. Where does she belong? From what we can see with Charlotte Brown, she was not of the great elite. She might not have been the exact same as what we would have seen with the senior officer's wife with the British forces, but she certainly would have been on par perhaps with officers' wives in the middling ranks, field grade, company grade, certainly provincial officers' wives. Now, again, I'm pointing this out with the recognition that with Braddock's and Forbes expeditions, we are not seeing officers' wives with these particular active engagements, these active campaigns, the way you would see in a longer term war where women might be following or might be garrisoned as the regiments go out on campaign in this. So that middling rank makes her a little bit different than senior officers' wives, perhaps. It is making her a bit different from most of the women followers who would have been more working class, lower class women who are following these soldiers who had volunteered or been drafted in some form or another into these forces. That might make her an exception. Another exception, big one that we don't tend to talk about, is the literacy. This is a woman who left a journal. She left a record, which, believe me, we wish that we had more women doing that for especially out of the common women who were following the ranks. So all of that is there. It makes her a bit different, okay? And it does mean, by the way, as a matron with that kind of position, certainly as she was attached to her brother, she was very much accepted within more the officer societies, and she would have been accepted by the better people in the communities through which the army marched. And that actually came out, and we see a bit of it in her writings, that after her brother's death at Fort Cumberland, she was then an unattached woman, even though she was still the matron. And she actually faced greater scrutiny about her reputation as an unattached woman. So a woman was more acceptable if she's attached. If she's unattached, it's like, watch out. This is a dangerous woman. Is this a woman that we have to think about as possibly engaged in prostitution or something else like that? You know, beware the unattached. Okay. So at that point, after her brother's death, other women attached to officers generally had to vouch for her as, if you will, one of theirs or acceptable to theirs. Now, I'll give you a comparison to Charlotte Brown. A comparison would be Martha May. She was with the later Forbes expedition. And May was a longtime follower of the British Army when she ran into some trouble with Colonel Henry Bouquet at the beginning of the Forbes expedition in 1758. Now, again, this is interesting. It's intriguing. We have Martha May's name where we don't have most of the others. Well, why do we have her name? The reason is she got into trouble. And to pick up on something that a fellow historian said at one point, and this was Ulrich, yes, Susan, who said, well-behaved women seldom make history, right? Well, Martha May was not well-behaved, and lo and behold, she ends up in the history books. There you go, she's named. Well, her misbehavior landed her in the Carlisle, Pennsylvania jail. How did she do this? She was one heck of a spicy woman, and she denounced Bouquet because her husband had been punished for infractions as a soldier. Well, she stood up for her husband and she denounced the colonel for doing that. Well, I'm sorry, that's not going to go so well with the colonel, and it certainly is not good for military discipline. So the trouble is because of doing that, she in turn ended up in jail and could have been left behind as the rest of the forces continued to march west. Well, that's the worst thing. No follower wants to be left behind. Okay, rations, your food, a sense of belonging, housing, duties, being with your family is all contingent on being able to be with them. Would you be able to, attach back with them if you're left behind? So she certainly does not want to be walking through the shades of death all by herself. She'd rather be doing it in association with Bouquet's forces. So she apologized profusely for abusing this good, compassionate Colonel Bouquet. You might as well lay it on really rich here. And she explained that, the reason I got so angry, the reason that I attacked you is my love for my husband. So please set me free. Now, this is what she said. So you think about it. And of course, I don't have the proper tone. I don't have the proper British accent. It could be a Cockney accent. It could be, but it would have been a lower accent of a British woman, of applying herself to Bouquet. I never will disoblige your honor, nor any other officer belonging to the army for the future, as I have been a wife for 22 years. Get that, I am a wife for 22 years and have traveled with my husband every place or country the company marched to. Every place. 22 years. as a soldier's wife, following where they go. So we're pushing it back from the 50s back to the 1730s here. Think about where else she might have been in Europe. And I have worked very hard ever since I was in the Army. She's in the Army. I hope your honor will be so good as to pardon me this once, that I may go with my poor husband one time more to carry him and my good officers water in the hottest battle, as I have done before, so that I can carry water. So here's this carrying water in hottest battle. Where do you think we get these ideas of Molly Pitcher carrying water? Well, first of all, it wouldn't have been real cold water, because cold water disease means if you've got overheated soldiers and you give them real cold water, they're going to, fall over dead. But she was then saying she had played a fundamental role, not just in the background, but contributing to them as they fought. So she argued this case that she was wed both to her husband and to the Army, and that legal attachment was significant, and let her rejoin the forces. So other women were very like her. This was their life. Their life is not the hard work on the farm. It's not the hard work as a servant in a household. It's not the hard work, in a shop somewhere. It is the work of following an army. Now, other women, by the way, were also following because they're refugees. So they're not necessarily always choosing it. They're kind of pushed into it as they were forced to flee from their homes. So, during the 7 Years' War, many Pennsylvania frontier women fled to the military forces that were marching through, and certainly to their forts and their encampments, because of both the Indian and the French attacks on their homes through the frontier or the borderlands districts of Pennsylvania. Some of them then would stay at the forts and then would join the other followers, choosing instead that they would then make a life, temporary or full-time, with those forces. So again, we see this diversity as we move into the borderlands of British followers, provincial followers, refugee followers, all becoming part of the images we should keep in mind as we look at these forces. So again, they're coming from and they're reflecting the social, economic, and regional strata of colonial, indeed all of imperial British America. They were diverse, but most were soldiers' wives. Okay. Most were white, but there were some Black women with them, both free and enslaved. So some were arriving as either free or enslaved servants, for instance, to officers, or the other one is as runaways, is that this is a way to get away from other masters, join with the military community, and start to work for their own freedom in some ways, in one of the most unfree situations of military life, but that's what they were doing. But the other part I want to point out for all of these women is that they're used to hardships. So if you're seeing women who are choosing to follow or remaining as they follow and dealing with these hardships, is to recognize that they're coming from lifestyles that were hard generally to begin with. Because sometimes you look at the conditions, and I do this even for the soldiers, and I go, oh my gosh, how they had to live for years on end through these campaigns and how tough it was. And then you start to think, well, how did they live when they were home? It's not like they all had indoor plumbing, access to medical care, always getting good food, having good shelter and the like. So was military life so much worse? Yes, you've got to go into combat. You have the other discipline, the other drill, and then you've got to go into combat. But for the day-to-day life, was it so much a ways different? And it would be the same for women. So let's look at some of those challenges. And again, a quick look at Charlotte Brown's story shows a few of them. So when she headed to the backcountry and she was moving out first to Fort Campbell and then Fort Cumberland in Maryland as they're moving up to Western Pennsylvania. And of course, she was moving along with her brother. So in that way, she's like others that they're accompanying their menfolk. But she was accompanied by a servant. Okay, accompanied by a servant who was the wife of an enlisted man. So here it is, we're seeing another follower, the wife of an enlisted man who has found herself a position as a servant to another woman who had been appointed to a position with these forces. So that provides us another avenue is to think about women followers who are looking for work, which means they can then supplement their rations, that they could make a few pence. That means they can buy things from sutlers, or they can buy things as they go through communities and perhaps make their life a bit better. So we've got that part. She was accompanied by 2 nurses. It's not said particularly, these nurses could have been drawn from the ranks of other followers, but some nurses were also recruited from the communities through which they marched, and they would have been somewhat like Charlotte Brown in that they were following because they had a particular position. She had 2 cooks. The cooks could have been women, but we also know that soldiers acted as cooks in the mess. That was not gendered, so we don't know absolutely about that. In fact, it could very well have been men that were cooking, because those cooks were not just cooking for Charlotte Brown and her brother, they were cooking and helping the 50 or so sick soldiers that were moving along with Charlotte Brown, her brother, her servant, and her nurses. So that gives us a little idea about who is moving into this backcountry. Well, how did they make that? Brown made the journey in a wagon. Most followers had to walk. So here's the distinction. Followers, when they could, would hop up on a wagon, and invariably you've got an officer telling them, get the heck off of that wagon again. The wagons were there. The oxen and the horses pulling those wagons were for the provisions. They were for the arms, the ammunition. They were there for the material goods that could not walk on their own. Soldiers and followers could walk on their own. They shouldn't be in the wagons. They walk it. Now, that said, Charlotte Brown may have been in a wagon, so that way she's different from other followers, but riding didn't mean that the journey was easy. Women and baggage, on wagons or not, were to follow to the rear of the troops. Well, think about it. As those troops are moving through and in the rear, you're eating their dust, or you're eating the mud left by those forces. So all of that's spilling up to them. That's part of their hardships. Now, in the case of Charlotte Brown's driver, he had had enough of that, and he pulled around and went to the front. So in that way, again, we see where better status could even help you on the march itself in there. So they had done that. And as they are on the march, by the way, they would be marching about 14, 17 miles a day. They'd have a break for a midday meal, perhaps. But you're having this long, difficult trip that you usually started before dawn and went well into the rest of the day, until about every 5 days or so, they would stop. And it was not to rest the soldiers so much as to rest the livestock. And by the way, that's very usual for many armies all the way into the 19th century. If we look at the frontier army, US Army, many times horses were considered more valuable than the soldiers, is keep your livestock going well. But in that time, in those breaks too, like the nurses or other cooks could then make bread They could cook up other rations that could be then packed and taken with them as they continued to march out. So by the time they kept marching, finally in June 12th, 1755, Brown and the others reached Fort Cumberland, which is where the troops for Braddock's expedition basically were garrisoning and getting ready for the next march out into Western Pennsylvania. Brown looked at it. She wrote that she thought it was the most desolate place that she had ever seen. It was a tough place. The fort, that little fort itself, had no internal water supply, which means it wasn't the greatest for fortifications, quite frankly. But it was also very crowded with not just the wives and children of the enlisted men who've been following, but all of those refugees who were moving in. So again, we get this other image, not just of a line of troops moving through the shades of death, but these encampments with all of these other people and livestock and others, and the sounds and the smells and the attempts to create order by which you can then move out and be prepared to fight. Well, when Brown arrived there in Fort Cumberland, she was sick. And indeed, others were sick. There's the possibility of malaria. Another distinct possibility, which I think might be even greater, is dysentery. You drink the wrong kind of water, you eat the wrong kind of things, and you're running for the necessaries or simply running back into the shades of death to deal with that issue. But it was moving through the camp, and it struck Brown's brother and her servant. So as Brown got there, and even as she was ill and she was a matron, she was then trying to serve the sick and take care of her brother and take care of her servant instead of them taking care of her. And it was there that they got word of Braddock's defeat. July 11th, 1755, the word got there. Now that's significant again. I want to point out when we look at women with the armies following, not all women would follow regiments as they move into campaign. Many would stay back into these garrisoned locations or these encampments. It certainly made sense for the expedition's general hospital to stay to the rear, and that's where you would send your sick and wounded out of the way. So they are to the rear and others were there. Some others will move with them. Those who move with the expedition are the women who are most mobile. They are women who are not necessarily carrying children with them. Usually if you've got children, you're requested to stay behind. Those who can move fast, who can bear a pack, who can support the movement out, not those who would hinder it in some form or another. So anyway, they heard in July 11th about the defeat. Within a few days, they are getting all of the wounded coming in. So Brown was left to deal with both the sick and the wounded through into July. And then indeed, until they finally evacuated Fort Cumberland and moved to Frederickstown in Maryland about a month or so later. So there's the hardships for her. And then here she is ill, she is down, she's dealing with the sick and the wounded, and they have to go back into, fall back in this retreat. At that point, Charlotte Brown was riding a horse instead of a wagon. So again, elite status, women aren't usually riding horses. That is very seldom. Like they're not on wagons, they're generally not on horses. Her nurse, one of the nurses walking with her, was to the side. So walking, not riding, was her companion. And there they were, traveling on back, sleeping on the ground like the soldiers do. And there they were, all the way until they could get back to Philadelphia. And by the way, in that trip back to Philadelphia, that included a fall from a horse. But there she gets back to Philadelphia, reports for duty, gets her quarters. She starts provisioning the hospital there and gets back to work for the soldiers, for the army at that point. She continued to move on with the hospital when it went up to New York City in February 56. And so she was continuing with the Army beyond her brother's death, still as a matron of the hospital, all the way up to Albany and to another borderland or backcountry in New York. So in that way, Charlotte Brown is saying, what was it like for an elite woman? In many ways, the conditions are the same, but as an elite woman, she was provisioned better, and she certainly could travel better than some of the other followers. So what she was doing, as she said, is a most desolate place. She was absolutely shocked. It was culture shock for her, as it was for the other followers and for many of the soldiers who were marching into the frontier of America. There was the isolation of the further that they got away from the coastal areas, the numbing routines of Army life, sometimes boredom. That I would say boredom was more in the forts. It was not along these particular expeditions as they were underway. Certainly intense physical labor, the disease, and of course, the possibility of capture and death as they did it. So again, you're seeing that women are walking alongside the absolute physical labor, the physical, challenges of staying with an army. This is the same with General Forbes's troops as they marched over the Allegheny Mountains towards Fort Duquesne in 1758. Think about it. You're in skirts, you've got your pack on your back, you might have children with you, and you are wearing out a lot of shoe leather to get across those mountains. Every time I would take the turnpike, I would think about all those people as they were marching through those mountains and those woods, getting to Western Pennsylvania. Not an easy trip by any means in there. And women were doing it with the men. They shivered, they roasted according to the weather, drenched or parched, and they faced, as I said, the possibility of death or camp. And I wanted to point this part out with Braddock's expedition, and I'm doing many thanks to David Preston for some of these examples in here. As he pointed out, one eyewitness was looking at some of the women who had been to the rear of Braddock's expedition as it was moving to and across the Monongahela and continuing into the shades of death as it actually was. And this eyewitness saw an Indian shoot one of our women and begin to scalp her. So here is part of the challenges, that they are taking that risk too. There is none of this, oh, women are non-combatants, so you don't touch them. Quite the contrary. They can be targets, and they were targets as well in Western Pennsylvania. Now, in this case, as the woman was being scalped, the eyewitness says her husband, the soldier, turned around and shot the Indian. It does not say, unfortunately, whether she survived the scalping or not, which can happen. People did survive scalping. There was a French account that he finds out, the bodies, looking at the bodies of the great number of men killed. But that eyewitness also saw the bodies of 8 women or girls that were entirely stripped, lying promiscuously with the dead horses for more than half a league. Well, lying with the horses, that's because they would have been to the rear with the baggage wagons where the horses were. They could have been walking along with some of the artillery pieces with the wagons there. But again, the point of looking at them is that they were killed. Now, were they stripped? Not necessarily for a sexual reason, but because the Native Americans were saying they are stripping the soldiers as well as the women for these are the rewards of warfare, is these are what they are going to take back with them as their rewards for this engagement. There were other French accounts that were talking about the Indians taking captives. Well, first of all, these accounts mentioned that the Indians did not take many captives. It was more about just killing them. But they took some captives, they took them back to Fort Duquesne, where they did torture some of them, but among the captives were 7 women or girls, including one Agnes Hamilton, the wife of James Hamilton, who had belonged to the late Sir Peter Halkett's regiment. And that woman had told him that she and 13 others. Now, the thing about the 13 others is I think she was including 13 other captives, including men, that were all prisoners, not 13 other women. And they were all taken from the Monongahela, the battle at the Monongahela. So the threat continued for followers elsewhere. So the threat to the followers of Braddock's forces, the threat to the followers of Forbes' forces, they were real and they were echoed or mirrored elsewhere. For instance, there is the case of Betty Armstrong. In 1757, she appears at Fort Augusta, and she was a soldier's wife, and she had escaped captivity at some point, and she had managed to get to Juniata. Well, she had been taken prisoner at Juniata 18 months before she showed up at Augusta, Fort Augusta in 1757. So here's a soldier's wife who shows this initiative that, you're a prisoner, get away. But she made her way through the forest on her own to get back to a place of safety. So we've got, if you will, that kind of heroism in the face of those kind of challenges through all of this. Another thing that we see with them is, what do they do? Labor. In other words, war is work. If you think about, for the soldiers, war is combat. For the followers, war is work. Again, back to Charlotte Brown, she worked. She was there because she worked. She was matron. She supervised nurses. She organized hospital facilities. Supervisor, manager, that was her job. But what did the other followers do? As mentioned before, we can look at the nurses who accompanied her, but it wasn't just those who accompanied her, is that sometimes they were drafted from the ranks in there, this nursing. Now, soldiers nurse the wounded, but that would take them, or they would nurse the sick as well, but that would take them from other duties. You need them for those other duties. You need them on guard duty. You need them ready for combat. You need them to do the rest here. But so you turn to the follower women. You've got a labor pool right there, and they are already taking up space, and they may have already been rationed. Well, what are they doing to earn this? It's not enough that you are married to one of these soldiers and you were permitted to follow the army. What are you going to do for it? So they would look for volunteers. And when not enough women would volunteer to care for others outside of their own families, the army drafted them. They could draft them from the regiments. So understand, there may be that call for volunteering, but not, who would want to volunteer to go into regimental or garrison hospitals and deal with a lot of sick men in a time where we don't know how sickness always manifests itself, where they could get sick and indeed did get sick themselves? Do you want to put yourself in that kind of harm's way? So what regimental commanders would do is persuade them by promising full rations. You nurse, I will give you a full soldier's ration as opposed to a dependent's half ration. Get more. You would get allowances. You might get money. You would get a few pence a day for what you are doing in some form or another. Or at the same point you're giving them that carrot, you can also threaten them and say, if you don't do it, you're not going to get anything. No rations at all. We're going to shut you off. Heal or starve. Okay? Volunteer, get more. Don't volunteer, you're going to be in a world of hurt. So all of that comes in. Furthermore, quite frankly, once you're in doing nursing duty, this is not the nursing we know today. This is doing all of the scut work. They are not there for medical care. They are there to clean up. They are there to clean up the soldiers, to clean up the linens, to do all of the tasks that the surgeons and the matron order them to do. So that was their job, the housekeeping chores for this. But they were drafted. This is one of the things when we look at it and you go, women in the draft. Well, here they are being drafted at Raystown, Bedford, in August of 1758. Order said that 6 women from the line are to be sent immediately to the hospital to care for the sick. 8 days later, there was a reminder to the commanders, get those women here, send them up, and that they would be relieved every fortnight, every 2 weeks from that task. So there was to be a rotation of these followers in the hospitals, okay? Furthermore, those orders at that point was specifying where these women were to come from. In that case, 2 of the women from the Highland regiments, okay, coming out of Britain, 2 from the Pennsylvania regiments were to be sending there. 1 was to come from the Maryland company, 1 from the lower county companies in there. So they're spreading it out. But it tells us, by the way, that there were women with the Pennsylvania regiments. There were women with the Maryland companies. There were women with the Delaware or the lower county ones. There were women with the Highlands. This is how we find them, is that tells us they're there and they are being drafted to go to work into the hospitals. By the way, we can even see a little bit there with dear old Colonel George Washington. At one point in September there in 58, Bouquet had to write Washington and say there was no room for Washington's sick at Raystown, so he was to leave them at Fort Cumberland as he was coming up, so he was marching north. Bouquet promised that there would be a surgeon there would be medicine and hospital at Cumberland to take care of them. But Washington, Colonel Washington, had to order a sufficient number of women with his troops to attend them as nurses. So you think about it, Colonel Washington has to look back at all his troops and he's looking at the women and telling some of them, you cannot keep accompanying your husbands all the way up, okay, towards Ligonier, towards the fights there. They're going to stay at Cumberland in this. Women were not only tending the patients, they were sometimes the patients themselves due to the accidents that they had, due to childbirth. So you think about it, they're marching along, they're pregnant, they give birth. After giving birth, they pick up that child, that infant, that's part of their burdens, and they carry on with this. They have other illnesses, including what we today call STDs. Though note, with STDs, or as they would say, the venial distempers or venereal diseases, any woman suspected of being infected with such were to be examined, and if they are indeed found to have it, is either to be kept in the hospital till cured or turned out of camp. So this is compared to the soldiers who would never have been turned out of camp if they had it. They would have, been put under medical care and still marched out if they were at all able to go. So other things that we see them, as I said, many of the nurses were doing housekeeping, and that was right in line with one of the other most important jobs that they had, which is washing, being washing women in this. And that was truly a big thing. And that would think about what that entailed for these women. They were washing clothes, going to nearby creeks and streams and lake shores. But if they did, again, they had to follow orders. First of all, they had to know where they could go or not. They were not to wash clothes where soldiers were taking their drinking water or indeed going and taking baths. Makes sense. You don't want that dirty water being picked up by these soldiers. That's where you could get dysentery too. You certainly don't want them, washing clothes or dealing with other issues that are too close also to the necessaries. Again, cross-contamination in some form or another. As they did that work, Their work was regulated, how much they could charge, per shirt, per cravat, per stockings, in any things that they could do. So it was a heavily regulated thing to do, but an essential thing for the hygiene, for the health care of these soldiers. Other things that we saw women involved with was suttling or packing and peddling goods with them. If it was a legitimate enterprise, they were accepted, they were certainly welcomed, that we see as well. Unfortunately, some women would try to suttle liquor. That was a heavily regulated enterprise, and that could get them into a great deal of trouble with the military authorities. We see that primarily later, once we see the soldiers really hunkering down after the Forbes campaign, and Fort Ligonier is built up, Fort Pitt is built up, the communities are growing around it, and you can see women starting to create dram shops, these little huts where they are dispensing alcohol, and that was contrary to order and good discipline. So they were not allowed to do it, but they could be involved with that as well. So we're looking at all of these things that women were doing, and in the process, the great majority probably were doing their job within the orders by which they were required, and thus we don't see their names. They are not remarked as troublemakers. Most of the ones we do see as names are the ones that created disorder, and indeed there was. Women engaged in fights, they engaged in robberies, they engaged in assaults. They were the victims of all of those as well, which meant that they could have been put up to courts-martial, but I haven't seen much evidence of that for Western Pennsylvania. More likely what they were done is simply said, you are no longer welcome here. You are to leave this fort. You are to leave this encampment. Get out. And thus they lose their attachment. They lose their rations. They lose their ability to maintain themselves. And let me tell you, they did see that and they didn't like it. And one of the things officers commented on is banishing women, and then the banished women keep coming back. So they might leave shortly, they walk a little ways in, hoping that things are going to die down a bit, and back they come, especially if there is a replacement or reinforcements coming in, and they will attach themselves to those reinforcements and march right back into the camp that they have. So that is giving us an idea of, through Charlotte Brown and Martha May and a few other women, about what life was like for women with these forces, that they were definitely part of it, that they supported the incursion into Western Pennsylvania. They were with Braddock, they were with Forbes, they were essential to the logistics of these forces. Were they celebrated? Not so much. Every once in a while, you could see a woman celebrated if she did something phenomenal and it made for a good story in the newspapers and it showed morale. It would be representative of how dedicated they were to supporting the forces in some form or another. We saw a bit of that in later accounts there, and I'll give you one. This was actually for a woman. It was based on an obituary in 1779, and this was a Mrs. Stone. She was 43 years old when she died in Ireland in 79, but she had followed her husband in America during the 7 Years' War. So 79, you put it back another 20, she was in her early 20s with her husband as she had moved through the shades of death in America. Now, the obituary put her down as a small and handsome woman who accompanied Sergeant Stone. Well, they're making her into a heroine. She did it, she said, and it said, no consideration of fear could make her leave her husband's side through 9 engagements in which he was concerned, in the course of which she twice helped carry him off wounded from the field of battle. At the siege of Louisburg, at a time when many of our troops were killed, She supplied the living with powder cartridges from the dead and animated the men in the ranks next to her by her words and actions. Though a woman of most surprising integrity, she was never known to be guilty of anything that would impeach her delicacy or violate the modest demeanor of her sex. That's how people sometimes remembered a few women with the armies. The great majority, they did not name, they did not support, because they did not have the delicacy, if you will, or the modest demeanor. Like Martha May did not have that modest demeanor of her sex. They were rough, they were ready, they were with the troops. And indeed, if we dig into these stories, not just the ones that laud them, but the other stories that are in the order books and the court-martial accounts, such stories echoing for various conflicts at various places, Braddock's, Forbes expeditions, moving all the way up through the entire 7 Years' War and into the Revolution. All of these accounts provide evidence that followers were certainly soldiers too, and definitely not saints, like Sergeant Stone's wife. And I think I'll stop there and open for questions.